The humid Louisiana air hung thick as molasses over Beaumont Plantation on the evening of October 13th, 1781. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, swaying gently in the oppressive breeze that carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and something darker, the lingering smell of fear that had soaked into the very soil of the plantation grounds. Inside the grand mansion, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across mahogany walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Beaumont ancestors. Tonight, the estate buzzed with anticipation for Master Edmund Beaumont's 45th birthday celebration. Carriages had been arriving since sunset, depositing Louisiana's elite onto the circular drive lined with flickering torches. In the sweltering kitchen below stairs, Mama Rose moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent 30 years navigating these spaces. Her dark hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, worked methodically as she prepared the evening's feast. At 52, she was the undisputed queen of the Beaumont kitchen, her recipes legendary throughout the parish. But tonight, those same hands trembled slightly as she reached for a small cloth pouch hidden beneath the flour sacks. "Mama Rose, Master Edmund wants to know if the gumbo ready," called out young Samuel, barely 16, and still learning the careful dance of servitude that kept them all alive. Rose's weathered face remained impassive as she stirred the large pot, the rich brown roux swirling like the muddy waters of the Mississippi. "Tell Master Edmund, his gumbo be ready when it ready," she replied, her voice carrying the authority that even the white overseers rarely challenged when it came to kitchen matters. Samuel hesitated at the kitchen door, sensing something different in the air tonight. The other house slaves moved with unusual tension, their conversations dying to whispers whenever he approached. Even old Thomas, who had been at Beaumont longer than anyone could remember, kept glancing toward the main dining room with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. Upstairs, the dining room filled with the cream of Louisiana society. Plantation owners, merchants, and their wives adorned in silk and jewels took their seats around the massive oak table that could accommodate 20 guests. Master Edmund Beaumont, a portly man with thinning hair and cold blue eyes, held court at the head of the table, regaling his guests with stories of his latest business ventures and the proper management of his human property. "The key to a profitable plantation," Edmund declared, raising his crystal goblet of imported wine, "is maintaining absolute discipline. These people must understand their place in the natural order." His guests nodded approvingly, their laughter echoing through the mansion, while below, in the quarters where the enslaved lived, a different kind of gathering was taking place. In the shadows between the crude wooden buildings, whispered conversations carried news that had been spreading like wildfire through the slave networks across Louisiana. Mama Rose had been born on this plantation, had watched her mother die from exhaustion in these very fields, had seen her own children sold away one by one until only the memories remained. But tonight, she carried something more than memories. She carried the weight of justice delayed, but not denied. As the evening progressed, the sounds of revelry from the main house grew louder. The guests had moved through several courses, each prepared with Rose's usual expertise. The pralines were perfectly caramelized, the jambalaya seasoned to perfection, and the cornbread still warm from the oven. But the pièce de résistance, Master Edmund's favorite gumbo, remained in the kitchen, waiting for the perfect moment. Rose stood before the massive pot, the ladle heavy in her hand. Around her, the kitchen had grown quiet, except for the bubbling of the stew and the distant sound of piano music drifting down from above. She thought of her daughter, Marie, sold to a sugar plantation in Baton Rouge when she was only 14. She thought of her son, Jacques, who had tried to run and whose screams had echoed across the plantation for 3 days before they finally stopped. The small cloth pouch lay open on the wooden counter beside her, its contents, a fine white powder, barely visible in the candlelight. It had taken her months to accumulate enough of the oleander extract, carefully dried and ground from the beautiful but deadly flowers that grew wild along the plantation's borders. The old woman who had taught her about plants and their properties had been very clear about the dosage needed and the time it would take to work. "Mama Rose?" Samuel's voice startled her from her reverie. "They asking for the gumbo now?" She nodded slowly, her decision made long ago but crystallizing in this moment. With steady hands, she stirred the powder into the rich, dark stew, watching it disappear completely into the complex mixture of spices and ingredients. The gumbo looked exactly as it always did, perfect, aromatic, and deadly. "Help me carry these bowls upstairs," she instructed Samuel, ladling the gumbo into the finest china bowls reserved for special occasions. "And Samuel," she added, her voice carrying a weight that made the young man look up sharply, "whatever happens tonight, you remember that sometimes justice comes in ways we don't expect." As they climbed the narrow servants' stairs toward the dining room, Rose could hear Master Edmund's booming voice praising the evening's meal and calling for his favorite dish. The irony wasn't lost on her. He would die eating the very food prepared by hands he considered property, in a house built by the labor of people he refused to see as human. The dining room doors swung open, and Rose entered, carrying the silver tray that would change everything. The guests' faces turned toward her with the casual indifference they always showed the help. But tonight, she met their eyes with a steady gaze that seemed to look right through them. "Ah, Rose," Master Edmund called out jovially, his face already flushed from wine. "Finally, the famous Beaumont gumbo. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to taste the finest gumbo in all of Louisiana." As Rose began serving the steaming bowls, placing Master Edmund's portion directly in front of him, she felt a strange calm settle over her. 30 years of planning, of waiting, of enduring had led to this moment. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 o'clock, its deep tones seeming to mark not just the hour, but the beginning of the end. Master Edmund lifted his spoon with theatrical flourish, inhaling deeply the aromatic steam rising from his bowl. "To another year of prosperity," he declared, and took his first spoonful of what would be his last meal. Chapter 2. The Last Supper. The grandfather clock's chimes had barely faded when Master Edmund took his second spoonful of gumbo, his face lighting up with the satisfaction of a man accustomed to having his every desire fulfilled. Around the table, his guests followed suit, their silver spoons clinking against the fine china as they savored what they believed to be simply another example of Rose's culinary mastery. "Magnificent as always, Rose," declared Mrs. Evangeline Thibodeau, the wife of a neighboring plantation owner. "You simply must share your secret with my cook." Rose stood silently by the sideboard, her hands clasped behind her back, watching with the patience of someone who had learned to wait. "No secret, ma'am," she replied quietly. "Just time and the right ingredients." The irony of her words hung in the air, unnoticed by the assembled guests who continued their animated conversations about cotton prices, the latest fashions from New Orleans, and gossip from other plantations. Master Edmund dominated the discussion as he always did, his voice growing louder with each glass of wine. "I tell you, gentlemen," he proclaimed, gesturing with his spoon, "the key to managing these people is consistency. They must know that any transgression will be met with swift and decisive punishment. Just last week, I had to make an example of one of the field hands who was caught stealing corn." Rose's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She remembered that example, a young man named Peter who had taken a handful of corn to feed his sick child. The whipping had lasted until sunset, and Peter still couldn't work properly. As the minutes ticked by, Rose began to notice the first subtle signs. Master Edmund's face, already flushed from wine, seemed to be taking on a slightly different hue. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his water glass, and she caught him pressing his other hand briefly to his stomach. Samuel, who had been standing near the kitchen door, caught Rose's eye. She gave him the slightest nod, a signal they had discussed. The young man slipped quietly from the room, his task to spread word through the quarters that tonight would be different, that they should be ready for whatever came next. "Rose," Master Edmund called, his voice carrying a slight edge of irritation. "This gumbo seems different tonight, more bitter than usual." "Perhaps it's the wine, Master Edmund," Rose replied smoothly. "Sometimes the flavors don't mix well." He grunted and took another spoonful, unwilling to admit that anything prepared in his kitchen could be less than perfect, especially in front of his guests. But Rose could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he kept touching his throat as if something wasn't quite right. The conversation continued around the table, but Rose noticed that Master Edmund was participating less, his contributions becoming shorter and less coherent. Mrs. Thibodeau was telling a story about her recent trip to New Orleans, her voice carrying clearly through the room, when Master Edmund suddenly pushed back from the table. "Excuse me," he muttered, his face now noticeably pale beneath the flush. "I need some air." He stood unsteadily, one hand gripping the back of his chair. The oleander was working faster than Rose had expected. Perhaps his consumption of wine had accelerated the process. She watched as he took a few steps toward the French doors that led to the veranda, his gait becoming increasingly unsteady. "Edmund," called out his wife Margaret, a thin woman with sharp features who had always treated the house slaves with particular cruelty. "Are you quite well?" Just need some air," he repeated, but his words were beginning to slur slightly. The guests were starting to notice now, their conversations dying as they turned to watch their host's obvious distress. Rose moved forward as if to assist, playing her role perfectly. "Master Edmund, you want me to fetch the doctor?" "No!" he snapped, then immediately winced, as if the effort of raising his voice had caused him pain. "I'm fine. Just something I ate." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Rose, but she maintained her expression of concerned servitude. Around the table, the guests were beginning to murmur among themselves, their festive mood rapidly deteriorating as their host's condition became increasingly apparent. Master Edmund made it to the French doors, but had to lean heavily against the frame. His breathing was becoming labored, and Rose could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool evening air flowing in from the veranda. "Perhaps we should call for Dr. Rousseau," suggested Mr. Thibodeau, rising from his chair. "Edmund, you look quite unwell." "I said I'm fine." Master Edmund's voice cracked as he spoke, and he doubled over suddenly, one hand clutching his stomach. The sound that escaped him was somewhere between a groan and a gasp, and it sent a chill through the assembled guests. Rose stepped forward again, her movements deliberate and calm. "Master Edmund, let me help you to your room. You need to rest." But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late for rest, too late for doctors, too late for anything except the justice that had been 30 years in the making. Master Edmund's legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees on the Persian rug, his breathing becoming increasingly ragged. The dining room erupted into chaos. Mrs. Beaumont screamed and rushed to her husband's side, while the male guests shouted conflicting orders about fetching doctors and sending for help. In the confusion, Rose stepped back into the shadows, watching as the man who had owned her, who had treated her as property, who had sold her children, finally faced a reckoning he couldn't buy or beat his way out of. Master Edmund's eyes found hers across the room, and in that moment she saw recognition dawn in his fading gaze. He knew. Somehow, despite his pain and confusion, he understood what had happened and who was responsible. His mouth opened as if to speak, to accuse, but only a strangled sound emerged. "Get him to his room," Mrs. Beaumont was crying, her usual composure completely shattered. "Someone ride for Dr. Rousseau immediately." But Rose knew no doctor would arrive in time, and even if one did, there was no antidote for what Master Edmund had consumed. The oleander would finish its work, and by morning, Beaumont Plantation would have a new reality to face. As the guests struggled to lift their host's increasingly limp form, Rose quietly slipped from the dining room. She had work to do, not the kind that had defined her life for 30 years, but the work of preparing for what would come next. The other slaves needed to know that everything was about to change, and they needed to be ready for the chaos that would surely follow. Walking through the kitchen toward the back door, Rose paused at the large pot that still held the remainder of the gumbo. Without hesitation, she lifted the heavy vessel and carried it outside, dumping its contents into the pig trough, where the evidence would be consumed and forgotten by morning. The night air was thick with the sound of crickets and the distant cry of a night bird, but from the main house came the sounds of panic and confusion. Rose stood for a moment in the darkness, feeling the weight of what she had done settling around her like a cloak. Justice, she had learned, was not always swift and it was not always pretty, but sometimes it was the only thing that could balance the scales of a world built on suffering and cruelty. Tonight, those scales had finally begun to tip. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. Dr. Rousseau arrived at Beaumont Plantation just after midnight, his black medical bag clutched tightly as he was led through the mansion's grand foyer by a visibly shaken Mrs. Beaumont. The house, which had been filled with laughter and music just hours before, now felt like a tomb, heavy with silence, broken only by the soft sobbing of the lady of the house and the hushed whispers of the remaining guests who had stayed to help. "When did the symptoms begin?" Dr. Rousseau asked as they climbed the mahogany staircase toward the master bedroom, his weathered face grave with concern. "During dinner," Margaret Beaumont replied, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He complained the gumbo tasted bitter, then became ill so suddenly. Doctor, you must save him. I cannot manage this plantation alone." Rose stood in the shadows of the upper hallway, having been summoned to assist with whatever the doctor might need. She watched as Dr. Rousseau entered the master bedroom, where Edmund Beaumont lay writhing on the four-poster bed, his face now a sickly grey color and his breathing shallow and labored. The physician immediately began his examination, checking pulse, pupils, and listening to the patient's heart with his wooden stethoscope. Rose could see the growing concern on his face as he worked, the way his brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. "Has he vomited?" Dr. Rousseau asked. "Violently for the past hour," Mrs. Beaumont confirmed, "and he keeps complaining of burning in his throat and stomach." Rose knew these symptoms well. They matched exactly what the old root woman had described when teaching her about the oleander's effects. The burning sensation, the nausea, the irregular heartbeat that would eventually stop altogether. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "I need to speak with whoever prepared the evening's meal," Dr. Rousseau announced suddenly, turning to face Mrs. Beaumont. "Food poisoning can present in many ways, and I need to understand exactly what he consumed." Mrs. Beaumont's eyes immediately found Rose in the hallway. "Rose prepared everything, as she always does. Rose, come here immediately." Rose stepped forward with the same calm demeanor she had maintained all evening. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Rousseau studied her with sharp eyes. He was one of the few white men in the parish who had always treated the enslaved with a measure of respect, perhaps because his medical training had taught him that suffering knew no color. "What did Master Beaumont eat tonight that was different from the other guests?" "Nothing different, Doctor," Rose replied truthfully. "Everyone ate the same food from the same pots." "Yet he's the only one showing symptoms," Dr. Rousseau mused, returning to his patient. Master Edmund's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His skin had taken on a bluish tinge, and his breathing was becoming increasingly erratic. From the bed came a weak voice, barely above a whisper. Rose did this." Dr. Rousseau leaned closer. "What did you say, Edmund?" But Master Edmund's eyes had rolled back, and his body began to convulse. Mrs. Beaumont screamed and grabbed the doctor's arm. "Do something, please!" Rose watched from the doorway as Dr. Rousseau worked frantically, trying various remedies from his bag: laudanum for the pain, ipecac to induce more vomiting in hopes of clearing whatever poison remained in the system, cold compresses for the fever that had begun to spike. But Rose knew it was all futile. The oleander had done its work too well. As the night wore on, word spread throughout the plantation. In the quarters, the enslaved people gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what this might mean for their future. Some were frightened. A dead master often meant a plantation would be sold, families separated, lives uprooted once again. Others felt a grim satisfaction that justice had finally come to a man who had shown them nothing but cruelty. Samuel found Rose in the kitchen just before dawn, where she was mechanically cleaning the pots and pans from the evening's meal. "Mama Rose," he whispered, "they saying Master Edmund gonna die. They saying maybe someone poisoned him." Rose continued scrubbing a cast-iron pot, her movements steady and rhythmic. "People say lots of things when they scared, child. Don't mean any of it true, but if he dies, what happens to us? What happens to the plantation?" It was a question Rose had considered many times over the past months as she planned her revenge. "Change coming, whether we ready or not," she said finally. "Question is whether we gonna let change happen to us, or whether we gonna be part of making it happen." Upstairs, Master Edmund Beaumont drew his last breath, just as the first rays of sunlight crept through the bedroom windows. "Doctor?" Rousseau closed the dead man's eyes and turned to face the widow, who had collapsed into a chair beside the bed. "I'm sorry, Margaret. There was nothing more I could do." "What killed him?" she asked through her tears. "Was it his heart? His stomach has been troubling him lately." Dr. Rousseau was quiet for a long moment, his medical mind working through the symptoms he had observed. The rapid onset, the specific combination of gastrointestinal and cardiac symptoms, the way the patient had deteriorated despite treatment, it all pointed to poisoning, though he couldn't be certain what type without further investigation. "I'll need to examine the body more thoroughly," he said carefully, "and I'll want to speak with everyone who had access to his food tonight." Mrs. Beaumont's grief-stricken face suddenly hardened. "You think someone did this deliberately? You think one of the slaves?" "I think we need to be very careful about making accusations without proof," Dr. Rousseau replied firmly. "But yes, the symptoms suggest poisoning of some kind." As news of Master Edmund's death spread beyond the plantation, Rose knew that the most dangerous time was just beginning. Suspicion would fall on the enslaved people. It always did when something went wrong in the white world. There would be questions, investigations, perhaps even torture, as the authorities tried to find someone to blame. But Rose had planned for this too. She had been careful to leave no evidence, had made sure that multiple people had access to the kitchen throughout the evening, had prepared the food in full view of others. Most importantly, she had the protection of being indispensable. She was the only one who knew all the recipes, all the household routines, all the intricate details that kept the plantation running smoothly. As the sun rose over Beaumont Plantation on October 14, 1781, Rose stood on the back porch of the main house, looking out over the fields where she had spent her entire life in bondage. Master Edmund was dead, but his death was only the beginning. The real work, the work of surviving what came next, was just starting. In the distance, she could see riders approaching on the main road. Word had already reached the neighboring plantations, and soon the house would be full of white men asking questions, making demands, deciding the fate of everyone who lived and worked on these grounds. Rose straightened her shoulders and walked back into the kitchen. She had breakfast to prepare for the widow and her guests, just as she had prepared thousands of meals before. But everything was different now, and everyone, black and white alike, would have to learn to navigate this new reality. The age of Master Edmund Beaumont was over. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen. Chapter 4. The Investigation. Sheriff Claude Boudreau arrived at Beaumont Plantation 3 days after Master Edmund's death, accompanied by 2 deputies and a grim determination to get to the bottom of what was already being whispered about in every parlor and tavern from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. The death of a prominent plantation owner under mysterious circumstances was not something that could be quietly buried, especially when rumors of poisoning had begun to spread like wildfire through Louisiana's tight-knit planter society. Rose watched from the kitchen window as the sheriff's party dismounted near the main house, their horses snorting and stamping in the October heat. She had spent the past 3 days maintaining her usual routines, cooking, cleaning, managing the household staff, while carefully observing the chaos that had engulfed the plantation since Master Edmund's death. Mrs. Beaumont had barely left her room, leaving the day-to-day operations in the hands of the overseer, a brutal man named Caleb Morrison, who had immediately increased security around the quarters and instituted a strict curfew. The other slaves moved through their tasks with the heightened awareness of people who knew they were being watched, suspected, and judged. "Rose!" called Mrs. Beaumont from the top of the stairs, her voice hoarse from crying. "The sheriff wants to speak with you in the parlor." Rose dried her hands on her apron and made her way through the house, past the draped mirrors and stopped clocks that marked a household in mourning. The parlor, usually a showcase of the Beaumont family's wealth and status, felt oppressive now, its heavy furniture and dark wood paneling seeming to absorb what little light filtered through the drawn curtains. Sheriff Boudreau was a large man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had built his reputation on being thorough and fair, but Rose knew that fairness for a white sheriff in 1781 Louisiana had very different meanings, depending on the color of the person standing before him. "Rose, isn't it?" he said, consulting a small notebook. "You've been the head cook here for how long?" 30 years, sir," Rose replied, keeping her voice steady and respectful. "And you prepared all the food for Master Beaumont's birthday dinner?" "Yes, sir." "Same as I always do for special occasions?" Sheriff Boudreau studied her carefully, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of deception. "Dr. Rousseau tells me that Master Beaumont's symptoms were consistent with poisoning. You know anything about that?" "No, sir. Master Edmund ate the same food as everyone else. Nobody else got sick." "That's what's puzzling," the sheriff admitted. "If the food was poisoned, why didn't the other guests become ill? Unless..." He let the implication hang in the air. Rose met his gaze steadily. "Unless what, sir?" "Unless someone made sure the poison only went into Master Beaumont's portion." The accusation was out in the open now, and Rose felt the weight of 30 years of careful planning and patience resting on this moment. "I served everyone from the same pots, sir. Ask any of the other house slaves. They all saw me cooking and serving." Sheriff Boudreau made a note in his book. "I intend to. But first, I want you to walk me through everything you did that evening, from the time you started cooking until Master Beaumont became ill." For the next hour, Rose recounted the events of October 13th with careful precision, describing each dish she had prepared, the timing of the meal service, and the reactions of the guests. She spoke truthfully about everything except the small cloth pouch and its deadly contents, weaving a narrative that was both honest and carefully incomplete. "You mentioned that Master Beaumont complained the gumbo tasted bitter," Sheriff Boudreau noted. "Did you taste it yourself?" "Yes, sir. Tasted fine to me. I thought maybe the wine was affecting his taste." "And where is the remainder of that gumbo now?" Rose had been expecting this question. "Fed it to the pigs the next morning, sir. Can't let good food go to waste, and with Master Edmund dead, nobody else wanted to eat it." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Convenient, just practical, sir. Been managing this kitchen for 30 years. I know what to do with leftovers." Sheriff Boudreau spent the rest of the day interviewing other members of the household staff. Samuel, when questioned, confirmed that Rose had prepared all the food in the usual manner and that he had seen nothing suspicious. The other house slaves provided similar testimony, their stories consistent and unremarkable. But Rose knew that consistency wouldn't be enough to satisfy the sheriff's suspicions. That evening, as she prepared a simple supper for Mrs. Beaumont and the few relatives who had come to help with funeral arrangements, she overheard a conversation that confirmed her fears. "I don't care how long she's been here," Mrs. Beaumont was saying to her brother-in-law, Charles Beaumont. "That woman poisoned my husband. I can feel it in my bones." "Margaret, you need proof," Charles replied. "You can't just accuse someone based on feelings." "Then find proof." Mrs. Beaumont's voice rose to near hysteria. "Search her quarters, question the other slaves more harshly, do whatever it takes." Rose continued preparing the meal, her hands steady despite the conversation she was overhearing. She had known this moment would come, the moment when grief and suspicion would override reason and evidence. The question was whether she had been careful enough, whether her 30 years of observing and learning the ways of white justice would be enough to protect her. That night, Sheriff Boudreau and his deputies conducted a thorough search of the slave quarters. They found nothing in Rose's small cabin except the few personal possessions she was allowed to keep: a worn Bible, some cooking implements, and a small collection of dried herbs and spices that she used for both cooking and the minor medical care she provided to other slaves. "What's this?" Sheriff Boudreau asked, holding up a small bundle of dried leaves. "Sassafras," Rose replied calmly. "For tea when folks get stomach troubles." The sheriff examined the herbs carefully, but they were common plants that any cook might have. He found no oleander, no suspicious powders, nothing that could be used as evidence of poisoning. The investigation continued for another week, with Sheriff Boudreau interviewing neighbors, examining the kitchen and dining room, and even consulting with Dr. Rousseau about possible sources of poison. But without physical evidence or a credible witness, the case began to stall. Rose watched it all with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for justice. She continued her duties, maintained her respectful demeanor, and answered every question with the same calm consistency. Gradually, she could see doubt creeping into the sheriff's investigation. The problem, Rose realized, was that the white authorities couldn't conceive of a slave being clever enough to plan and execute such a sophisticated crime without leaving evidence. Their own prejudices worked in her favor. They expected any violence from enslaved people to be crude, impulsive, easily detected. The idea that someone they considered property could outwit them was almost unthinkable. As October drew to a close, Sheriff Boudreau made his final report to Mrs. Beaumont. Rose was not present for that conversation, but she could hear the widow's angry voice echoing through the house afterward. The official conclusion was that Master Edmund had died of natural causes, possibly a heart attack brought on by excessive drinking and rich food. It wasn't the justice Mrs. Beaumont wanted, but it was the justice Rose had carefully orchestrated. The truth would remain buried with Master Edmund, known only to the woman who had served it to him on a silver platter. But Rose knew that surviving the investigation was only the first challenge. Now came the harder task, surviving the aftermath of her actions and the changes they would bring to everyone who called Beaumont Plantation home. Chapter 5. The Legacy. 6 months after Master Edmund Beaumont's death, the plantation bore little resemblance to the grand estate it had once been. Mrs. Margaret Beaumont, overwhelmed by debt and unable to manage the complex operations of a working plantation, had been forced to sell portions of the land and most of the enslaved people to neighboring estates. The grand house, once filled with laughter and music, now echoed with emptiness and the ghosts of its former glory. Rose stood in the kitchen that had been her domain for 3 decades, packing the few belongings she would be allowed to take with her. Tomorrow, she would be transferred to the Thibodeau plantation, 20 miles downriver, where she would begin again in a new kitchen, under new masters, with new routines to learn and new injustices to endure. But something fundamental had changed in those 6 months. Something that went beyond the mere transfer of property and people. Word of Master Edmund's mysterious death had spread through the intricate network of communication that connected enslaved communities across Louisiana. The story had grown in the telling, becoming a legend whispered in the quarters on dark nights, the tale of Mama Rose, who had served justice with the same hands that had served countless meals. Samuel, now 17 and bound for a sugar plantation near New Orleans, found Rose in the kitchen as the sun set on their last day at Beaumont. The young man had grown taller and more serious in the months since Master Edmund's death, the events of that October night having aged him in ways that went beyond mere time. "Mama Rose," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Rose looked up from her packing, studying the young man's face. She saw in his eyes the same question that had been haunting the plantation for months, the question that no one had dared to ask directly. "What you want to know, child?" Samuel glanced around to make sure they were alone, then stepped closer. "Did you do it? Did you poison Master Edmund?" For a long moment, Rose said nothing. Outside, the sounds of the plantation's final day continued, the loading of wagons, the tearful goodbyes between families being separated, the harsh voices of overseers organizing the human cargo that would be dispersed across Louisiana. Finally, Rose spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some questions don't need answers, Samuel. Some things just need to be understood." Samuel nodded slowly, as if her non-answer had confirmed everything he had suspected. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're gonna carry this story with you wherever you go," Rose replied, returning to her packing. "And someday, when you got children of your own, you're gonna need to decide what parts of it to tell them." "What part should I tell them?" Rose paused, considering the question carefully. "Tell them that justice don't always come from courthouses and judges. Tell them that sometimes the only power we got is the power to choose how our story ends. And tell them that even when the world treats you like you ain't human, you still got the right to demand that the world answer for its sins." As the evening wore on, other members of the household staff came to say their goodbyes to Rose. She had been more than just a cook to many of them. She had been a healer, a counselor, a source of strength during the darkest times. Her departure marked the end of an era, the final dissolution of a community that had existed in the shadows of the big house. Old Thomas, who had worked at Beaumont longer than anyone, was among the last to visit. At 73, he was too old to be sold to another plantation and would remain at Beaumont to help maintain the property until Mrs. Beaumont decided its final fate. "You did what needed doing," he told Rose simply. "That man had blood on his hands, and blood calls for blood." "I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas," Rose replied, but there was no conviction in her denial. Thomas smiled, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been pride. "Course you don't. But I've been watching you for 30 years, Rose. I seen how you planned things, how you waited for the right moment. I seen how you never forgot nothing and never forgave nothing. Master Edmund thought he owned you, but he never understood what he was dealing with." As the old man shuffled away, Rose reflected on his words. Master Edmund had indeed never understood what he was dealing with. None of them had. They had seen only what they wanted to see, a compliant cook, a valuable piece of property, a woman who knew her place in their carefully ordered world. They had never seen the intelligence that observed and remembered every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of casual brutality. They had never recognized the strength that endured decades of dehumanization while planning for a reckoning that would come in its own time. They had never understood that treating people as property didn't make them property. It only made them dangerous. The next morning, As Rose climbed into the wagon that would take her to her new life at the Thibodeau plantation, she took one last look at the grand house where she had spent her entire adult life. Mrs. Beaumont stood on the front porch, watching the departure of her remaining slaves, with the bitter expression of someone who blamed them for her reduced circumstances. Their eyes met for a moment across the distance, and Rose saw in the widow's gaze the same suspicion that had haunted her for months. Mrs. Beaumont knew, or at least suspected, but knowing and proving were two different things. The truth would die with them both, becoming just another story whispered in the quarters, another legend of resistance and retribution. As the wagon rolled away from Beaumont Plantation, Rose thought about the legacy she was leaving behind. Master Edmund was dead, his empire crumbling, his name already beginning to fade from memory. But the story of what had happened that October night would live on, passed down through generations of enslaved people who needed to believe that justice was possible, even in a world that denied their humanity. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to the institution of slavery, Rose would be an old woman living in a small cabin in New Orleans, supporting herself by cooking for wealthy families who never suspected that their gentle gray-haired cook had once served the ultimate justice to a Louisiana plantation master. She would live to see her surviving children freed, would witness the collapse of the world that had enslaved her, would watch as the grand plantations were abandoned or transformed into something entirely different. But she would never speak directly about what had happened at Beaumont Plantation on October 13th, 1781. The truth would remain her secret, carried to her grave, along with the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, even in the darkest of times, the scales of justice could be balanced by those who had been denied justice for far too long. In the end, Mama Rose's revenge had been perfect, not because it was undetected, but because it was undeniable. Everyone knew what had happened, but no one could prove it. The story became legend, the legend became hope, and hope became the foundation for resistance that would eventually help bring down the entire system that had made such desperate measures necessary. The gumbo had been served, the debt had been paid, and justice, delayed but not denied, had finally come to Beaumont Plantation.